to welcome everybody. I'm Susan Lehman, and I'm a co-founder of Big Tent USA, and we're thrilled to have Roger McNamee here with us. Thanks to Gail Kosla hosting tonight. I just wanted to give anyone who is new to Big Tent sort of a primer on what Big Tent is, and hopefully you guys will all join us and support our endeavors. We are at this point a national grassroots advocacy organization that promotes moderate political platform focusing on the rights of all Americans, civic engagement, and good governance at both the state and the federal level. We were founded by a group of women in 2019. We hope to break through the political noise and to provide substantive information and concrete action items that are innovative and allow people to have a positive difference in our communities. We are Inclusive Coalition, and we stand for mainstream American values of decency, effective governance, truthful and ethical leadership, and equality, justice, and opportunity for all people. We have two focus areas, I'd say, pro-democracy reforms, which obviously all of us probably on this call are aware of that we need. And those go from voting rights to fair elections, to freedom of speech, to sort of the civic core issues that we really did come together for, which are about environment and healthcare, a lot of the issues that we all do care about. And so we try and bring together an educational forum of those issues, as well as the pro-democracy at the same time. So our first goal is to educate, and we want to increase civic awareness through curated resources and key stakeholder connections. If you go on our website, you'll see we have a lot of new resources that we brought in from podcasts, and we have virtual partner events that we don't host, but that we believe are really wonderful to go to since they're mostly free and on Zoom. We have podcasts and newsletters that we recommend. We try and do kind of both sides, sort of. We love to engage, so we're providing advocacy and funding opportunities using partner networks. So we use a group, we have Tent Talks that's run by Karen, Mara, and some other women in our group. And it's during the day, and we do speaker and advocacy training, including activations like email banking is, I guess, a new word, phone banking. And we've just launched Big Tent Ruthless Letter Writing, where we will be writing senators, 50 of them, and maybe more, about the importance of For the People vote, which was just passed by the House last night, and we really need to get it passed. Go on our website and you will see everything that you need. And we'll put the information in the text and the chat form. And then finally, we want to expand. We want to act as a resource center for moderate men and women to help broaden their civic education and ours, and increase our outreach so that we look forward to more partnering and opportunities within the community and throughout the country to sort of work together on trying to create a more civil government and hopefully our society. So with all that, we welcome you. We're very happy you're here, and I am going to pass the Zoom host to Gail Kosla, where she'll introduce Roger.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks once again, everyone, for joining us. In particular, I'm going to give a big shout out to my Tuck friends. As you can tell, we have a big group on this. And thanks for joining us to hear our fellow classmate and our good friend, Roger McNamee, speak to us about how big tech negatively impacts our democracy, our privacy, and what needs to be done. But before I get into Roger's amazing career, the past almost 40 years, a couple of logistical things I want to mention. First, the music that we played was from Roger's band, Moon Alice. As an aside, it's approaching 4:20 p.m. in California, where Roger is, which is perfect because that was one of the songs that we played. It's 4:20 somewhere, which, by the way, has been downloaded more than 5 million times. Roger, though, is here to give us an overview of the big tech topic. And then we're going to open this up for questions. So please put your questions in the chat down below, and we'll have the Q&A after his talk. We'll end at 8 p.m. Eastern time, but Roger's graciously agreed to stay on so we can continue the questions and answers. And anybody who wants to catch up, and everyone is welcome. After the Q&A, we'll stay on after that. But back to my friend Roger, who has had a fantastic life and career. Roger has been a Silicon Valley investor for decades. He has co-founded successful funds in venture, crossover, and private equity. He played himself in Social Dilemma as he was an early investor in Facebook, and he served as a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. He has written a few books, including the New York Times bestseller, Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. He's currently involved as a co-founder of Elevation Partners with another rock star, U2's Bono. Bono is my, I'm sorry. Roger has sounded the alarm of the dangerous impact of a largely unmoored business sector, but he's doing more than just sounding the alarm. He also has solutions. He recently wrote an editorial a week or two ago in the Washington Post titled, America Has Experience Curbing Dangerous Industries. We can do the same with tech. Roger, huge thanks for joining us today.
So Gail, thank you very much. And Susan, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. I want you to understand that I'm not here to convince you of anything, but what I would like to do is engage in a thought experiment. What I would ask you to do is for the next hour while we're together, just imagine how your life would be different or how your behavior would change if the things that I tell you turn out to be true. You'll be able to draw your own conclusions about whether what I'm saying is true or not. But the key thing to understand here is my goal is to start a debate. I think the country is at a very dangerous point in its life where in some ways we've forgotten the essential elements that bring us together as a country. And our situation has been aggravated very badly by unregulated technology. But unregulated technology is not how we got here. How we got here is that we got lazy and we got complacent. And we have, I think, a fantastic opportunity to fix that, but we cannot delay. And I think the best way to do this is not to tell people what to do, but rather to engage in a conversation where, I will give you my perspective on what's happened. You can ask me questions about it. And I will tell you my thoughts on what we ought to do about it. But again, I'm not putting those forward as the only solutions. I'm putting them forward as something that I've come to on the basis of years of studying the problem. But I do not pretend that these are the only solutions. And I would encourage all of you to participate. And something I would like to say for the members of Big Tent, in my world of activism, there are, roughly 50 or 75 people who are doing all the work and trying to do tech reform. 80% of them are women, and 25% of those are Black. And there's a really good reason for that. Women and people of color have been disproportionately harmed by everything that's going on here. And the harm has occurred not just to democracy, but also to public health, particularly in the context of the pandemic. And then also to our right to self-determination because of invasions of our privacy. And then lastly, the economy has been harmed because of unfair business practices, essentially defeating competition in our economy. So let me give you the big picture. I spent 34 years as an investor in Silicon Valley. And for most of that time, I was a true believer in the power of technology to make the lives of the people who used it better. Shortly after the millennium, so roughly 2004, things started to change in Silicon Valley. And it changed because the things that historically had limited Silicon Valley, which is to say, inadequate supplies of processing power, memory and storage and bandwidth, things that acted as constraints on entrepreneurs, constraints on engineers, things that had forced them to work really closely with customers to provide the functionality customers valued most and would pay the most for. All of those constraints went away. And suddenly, beginning in 2004, but really reaching a peak in 2010, the people in Silicon Valley no longer had to talk to customers. All of a sudden, there was enough of everything. And not just could you buy all the processing power, storage, bandwidth, and memory you needed, you could rent it on a credit card. So if you think back to the 90s, if you wanted to start a .com, you had to have $125 million to build the infrastructure to support your .com, just to turn it on. Today, you can go to Amazon Web Services with a credit card and you can rent it by the hour. And that lowered the barriers. And it caused people to think a very different way about startups, to think about tech businesses, because suddenly you could create, for the first time, you could create global products. You could create products that were bigger than countries. And you didn't have to listen to anybody. You could impose your view. And a series of historical accidents happened right after the millennium that took this thing from the really positive values that had infected Silicon Valley from the mid 50s to 2000, which were really an amalgam of the space program. If you think Apollo 13, you think about all those nerds working in mission control. They were mostly men, white shirts, really earnest, really, um, they very optimistic about everything, very idealistic. That value system merged with the hippie values of Atari and Apple in the 70s. Also idealistic, very optimistic, empowering. And those values lasted all the way through the millennium. But when the internet bubble burst, a different value system came in. And it was a fluke because it was brought by a very small number of people who were the first to have the insight that the limits on technology were going away, and the first to have the insight that the World Wide Web would go from being a web of pages, which is what the first generation internet was, to a web of people, social media. And those people are now known as the PayPal Mafia. You know them as Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, and Elon Musk. And they brought with them this intense libertarian value system that basically said some people are just smarter than everybody else, and that we should trust those people to make good choices on behalf of the whole world. And if some people get hurt along the way, well, that's just the cost of progress. That value system got very deeply embedded. And as it moved forward, the venture capitalists started to look for people who looked like those early folks. And what they arrived at was people who were, in a sense, sociopathic. They were, really indifferent to the needs of others. And if you think about the early days of Uber and the early days of Lyft or Robinhood, or many of these companies started since 2010. They began with the notion that the law didn't apply to them. And they began with the notion that there were people who really just didn't understand what technology and data could do. And it was okay to take advantage of that ignorance. And so the culture has changed really radically. And in my opinion, it has now become a danger to society. Let me explain where the danger comes from. So Google, which very smart people, in 2000 were feeling a lot of pressure to make money. And they had an insight that was as brilliant as the insight that the PayPal Mafia guys had. And that insight was that the days of oil dominating our economy were coming to an end, and we would need something new. And their insight was that they could position data as the most valuable resource in the economy. And the way they would do that would be to accumulate data from every possible source and convert human experience, so the things we do every day, into data that can then be used to create models that would predict our behavior and then create recommendation engines that would manipulate our behavior. It was a really big idea. And they knew that if they were open about it, that people would object. People would say, wait a minute, I don't want you manipulating my behavior. I don't want you controlling my choices. I like self-determination. I like autonomy. So what Google did was they pretended they were doing something else. So they start out with search, great product. Then they introduce email. And they say, it's free. So in order to pay for it, we're going to put ads in. In order to make the ads work, we're going to have to scan your emails for valuable information so that if you mention that you're thinking of going to Cancun, we can give you an ad for a hotel. People push back on the ads. So Google stopped doing the ads, but they didn't stop collecting the data. Then they start with maps. And with maps, the idea was, wow, Google's going to play God. They're going to control the traffic pattern. So if you wake up in the morning, let's say you have a 20-minute commute to work and you check Google Maps every morning to say, is my normal route clear or do I have to take a special route? The part that people don't realize is that Google's doing something that engineering is called load balancing. They look at all the possible people who want to drive and they figure out the optimal mix, which means every once in a while, it's your turn to take a slow route to work because that's better for the aggregate system. And this is the essence of what's wrong here. Google and Facebook believe that efficiency is the most important value for them to focus on. And you say to yourself, well, Roger, what's wrong with that? And I go, well, answer is normally nothing. In engineering, efficiency is really important. You make a motor, you make a piece of software, you want it to be efficient. The problem is that when you get to nation scale, efficiency conflicts with the values on which countries like the United States are built. Our founding values are self-determination, your right to make your choices, mine to make my own, but also democracy. And if you think about it, those two values are inefficient by design, right? If we each choose the clothing that we're going to wear, that's incredibly inefficient in comparison to Google telling you, I'm sorry, today everybody's wearing purple. And obviously, democracy is very inefficient compared to authoritarianism. So if you get to a situation where a company like Google or Facebook have more active users than there are in any country on earth, right? Because they're both roughly twice the size of China. If their vision is to impose efficiency on every country they operate in, you're going to have conflict. And so what Google did, so they went to Maps, they start telling people the efficiency of the map is more important than you're being able to determine where you drive. And because you trust Google, you don't realize that they're manipulating you. And then they start driving up and down your street and they take a picture of your house, kids, dog in front. Maybe they blur them out, but they claim they own that. Then they take a picture of your house from the top and they claim they own that. And they make that available to everybody. Now, those are things that previously were not private goods that somebody could turn into an asset. And Google's done that in every product they have. They're basically converting all human experience into data to make predictions that they can sell to advertisers, but also to make recommendation engines that they can use to manipulate behavior. Now, Google started doing that in 2000. They've been doing it ever since, and they're really good at it. And they've used it to build monopoly power in a whole series of industries where they both operate a marketplace and operate inside of it. Facebook had a very different model. Facebook's whole thing was, unlike those are very practical tools at Google. At Facebook, what are they doing? They're doing this social thing, very personal. And the signals that Facebook can get data on are really different than the ones that Google can get because Facebook can spot emotions. And so the challenge with Facebook is that they are in an advertising business where they're competing for attention against television and radio and movies and video games and books and TikTok. In order to keep our attention, they need to stimulate us emotionally. Because it turns out that when we're emotional, two things happen that are really valuable. One is that when you're emotional, it's easier to manipulate your behavior, to just get you to spend more time. Think about how slot machines work, right? They give you these periodic little wins in order to keep you going. And that's exactly how news feeds work. That's exactly how notifications work and tagging. Those things are all designed to hit portions of our psychology over which we have no control. But Facebook stumbled on something more powerful than that, which is that each of us, when we're in public, we have a mask on that makes us more like everybody else. And that's valuable. But if you really want to identify if you want to make the most economic value of a relationship, you need to know what people are like when they're alone, and you need to know what they're like when they're emotional. And so what they do at Facebook is they use algorithms to amplify the content that triggers us emotionally. And the thing is, for some people, that's pictures of puppies or cats. But the most reliable content for triggering emotions is stuff that triggers flight or fight. In short, the stuff that makes us afraid or outraged. What kind of content does that? Hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Now, they don't sit there, engineers looking at it and going, let's promote hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. What they say is, let's promote the content that is most engaging. And the truth is, when that's the only metric you're looking at, you are naturally going to promote hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And that has become central to their business model. Not because it's the most important percentage of it, but because it's the lubricant that makes the whole system work. And at Google, they discovered the same thing at YouTube, where the recommendation engine is designed to escalate you emotionally. And if you watch in any series of 6 or 7 recommendations, they're going to take you up an emotional scale. And it happens every single time. And the key thing here is that people have been pleading with these guys for 5 years to do this a different way. And they have done everything in their power to protect the existing business model. And prior to 2020, it was really hard for policymakers or even consumers to appreciate exactly how dangerous this is. But in 2020, it all came to a head. So let's start with the beginning of the year, and we'll use Facebook as the example. You all, I suspect, are familiar with QAnon, the conspiracy theory that thinks that Democratic leaders are all Satan-worshiping pedophiles who keep little children hostage in basements of pizza parlors. On Facebook, they were warned in 2018 about QAnon. In early 2019, the FBI put QAnon on a dangerous extremist list. Facebook did nothing. When called upon on the issue in the summer of 2020, Facebook admitted that, yeah, there are more than 3 million members of QAnon in Facebook groups or pages devoted to QAnon. Now, here's why that's a problem. QAnon, among other things, has absorbed the anti-vaccine movement. So it's a big vector for anti-COVID disinformation and anti-vaccine disinformation. But Facebook did a study in 2018 to find out exactly how much impact they had on political polarization. And one of the findings of the internal study at Facebook was that 64% of the time, nearly 2/3 of the time, when people join an extremist Facebook group, the reason they did it was because of a Facebook recommendation, which means that Facebook alone radicalized 2 million people into QAnon. So let's think about this. We get the beginning of the year, COVID's kicking up. There are millions of people in these Facebook groups spreading disinformation. The President of the United States is spreading COVID disinformation. And the next thing you know, people are dying in hospitals of COVID while denying with their last breath that COVID was real. You get George Floyd's murder and the protests that followed. The white supremacists who took over the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan, and who attacked people and killed people at some of those protests, all organized on Facebook. Many of them around QAnon as one of the organizing principles. The year goes on, the death count increases. And again, the US has a singularly bad response to COVID. And there are a bunch of factors involved, but one of them is COVID disinformation amplified by internet platforms, specifically YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. The election happens. President Trump declares that the election is a fraud and starts Stop the Steal. Stop the Steal is organized on Facebook. The primary players in it are not people in white supremacist groups. They're members of QAnon, most of whom are completely normal people who have been stuck in information bubbles created on products like Facebook, where they're being bombarded with this incredibly emotionally compelling hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. The net result is that we had an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. Tens of thousands of people, maybe 5% of them were people in organized extremist groups, but the vast majority of them were people who a year ago were completely normal, but got radicalized on internet platforms into QAnon, and then attacked the Capitol, absolutely convinced that the election was wrongfully decided, in spite of 61 court cases to the contrary and a whole bunch of hand recounts. We're at a very dangerous place right now. And the country has right now minority rule very deeply established in its system. And we right now do not have the ability to break out of that. And part of the reason for this is because we have no accountability. There's been no punishment for any of the members of Congress who helped to instigate the insurrection. There may not be any for President Trump for helping to instigate it. It's not clear who's going to be punished. Right now, they've rounded up a bunch of people who went into the Capitol, but none of the organizers. And all of this stuff happened in plain sight. I mean, it wasn't an intelligence failure. It was an action failure. I mean, if you had asked me a month before January 6th, did I think something was going to happen on January 6th? I would have said, of course I do. Just look at what's going on publicly on Facebook. You can see it. And so my point to you here is a very simple one. And we'll take care of this in Q&A, because I know you'll ask questions about the right way to handle this. But we have the power. There is nothing inevitable about any of this. There is no reason why we need companies to operate with the business model that Facebook and Google operate with. The chemicals industry used to operate by pouring mercury into fresh water and leaving mine tailings on hillsides. Manufacturing industries used to operate with child labor. The building trades used to build buildings that were made of flammable materials that were right next to each other with no building codes. Pharmaceutical industry used to ship really dangerous things. We've faced this problem before. It's just a matter of summoning the will. We have lots of examples of solving this exact problem in critical industries that we needed. The railroad industry used to kill like 15,000 people a year at work. We figured out how to fix that. Airplanes used to kill people all the time. We figured out how to fix that. That's all we need to do here. Anyway, I'm here to take your questions. I've set the table here. Let's have a really good conversation about what we do about it and what each and every one of you can do. Because believe it or not, this group right here, you have so much power in this moment. It's scary how much power you have. And what's really weird is you don't need to move 1 inch off of your charter mission. You get to do your mission because this is a moment when your voice is amplified about 100 times normal.
Wow, Roger, thank you. I mean, where to begin? I guess I was going to ask you first, tell us something good, but I think you did say something good was the fact that we can have laws or whatever that can.
Well, maybe I should just spend a moment talking about those things, okay? So where are we from a legal perspective? Here's the thing. People say, well, what can I do as a citizen? And they say, do I have to get rid of Facebook? Do I have to get rid of YouTube? And I go, you can if you want, but I don't think that's going to affect the outcome. I do think that it's really smart to have an iPhone because Apple actually tries to protect your privacy. And I think that really matters. And the new version of the operating system is going to have really interesting advances in privacy protection. And Android is a surveillance device. So if you want to do one simple thing, you go to iPhone from Android. That's the kind of no-brainer. But the rest of it's about political action. We've long since passed the point where individuals can affect this. But government is poised to do it. And much of this is bipartisan. Think of there are 3 elements of the solution. One is we want to look at safety. So the big issue that we have right now is unique among all engineering disciplines. The folks who work in Silicon Valley tech have no code of conduct that requires them to anticipate and mitigate harm before shipping a product. Everywhere else, in some industries like the building trades, people are personally on the hook if they violate a building code. But we don't even have the equivalent of a building code here, and we need to have one. We need to basically say, look, everybody must sign up to a code that says, I will do everything humanly possible to anticipate harms and mitigate them before I ship a product. And if I ship a product that harms people, I am going to, one degree or another, be personally responsible for that. And that will be true for the company. That'll be true for the executives. It'll be true for the engineers. Different weights that you put on it. And I'm totally open to how you implement that, but that's the basic notion. You may have heard of a thing called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is the law that, because of ridiculous interpretations by the court, has provided a safe harbor to internet platforms. So the key thing is, whether we get rid of it or amend it, I'll leave to other people. But the thing is, that is subordinate to this issue of incentives. We have to make people take safety as a paramount thing. To be an engineer should be about being nurturing and protective, not being, some evil James Bond bad guy, which is kind of where things are today. The second category relates to self-determination. And the issue here is that manipulating choices, manipulating behavior is un-American. To do so for profit should be illegal, and yet it is not. The current law in the United States is that everywhere you go, you leave digital footprints, and those footprints can be sold to anybody, and you have no control over it at all. So every time you go to the bank, every time you have a loan payment, every time that you write a check, all of those things go into data brokers and get sold. Every time you get a medical test, every time you get a prescription, that data is all sold. If you use a health or wellness application, all that data is available to be sold. Every time you move around on your cell phone, your location, second by second, is available. Every online app you use, so whether it's Gmail or the Microsoft equivalent, whether you use Office 365 online or the Google Apps, all that stuff is available for sale. This stuff starts with little kids, Chromebooks and Google Classroom starting in 4th grade. And Microsoft has the equivalent thing with Minecraft. Video game platforms like Xbox Live, all that data is for sale. But then also on things like LinkedIn, all that data is either for sale or use. So what happens is that Google and Facebook don't just have the data they have on you. They have all the data they can acquire from this universe of data brokers. And that gets compiled into a data voodoo doll. And they can use that data voodoo doll not only to predict your behavior, but to manipulate it. I think that should be illegal. Listen, we decided Ponzi schemes should be illegal. There are lots of business models that we've decided are illegal. We've placed lots of rules on business models that say things you can and cannot do. You can't pour mercury into fresh water. Okay, we need something like that here. And the good news is that in Congress, there are people who get this. The chair of the subcommittee that's relevant in the House, which is Jan Schakowsky of the Consumer Protection Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, is all over this. And she's all over safety. Both of those are in her purview. And the Energy and Commerce Committee, where Frank Pallone is the chair, Pallone is now supportive where previously he was not. That's incredibly encouraging. The third category is competition. So think of this as antitrust law. And in antitrust law, we're very far advanced. So the House Antitrust Committee produced a bipartisan report saying that Google, Facebook, and Amazon are all monopolies and all need to be very heavily regulated. The Department of Justice has a case against Google, the Federal Trade Commission against Facebook, and then 48 states plus 2 territories have cases against Facebook and Google. There are a total of 5 state AG cases. Again, mostly bipartisan. And what's interesting is that the safety stuff is also bipartisan. So this is a place where we can really make progress. I think regulation is coming. The most important thing is for everybody to understand you need all 3. You need antitrust to buy time, and then you need to address the failures of the market in the other 2. And so I'm very optimistic that we'll have that. What can you do? Members of Congress. The way it works in Congress is really simple. They want to do the right thing, but there has to be pressure from us. Every one of you knows members of Congress, you know senators. So one of your senators Blumenthal, Richard Blumenthal. He's one of the best guys on antitrust, but he needs to know the other things really matter. Your other senator, I mean, I really like Chris a lot. I just don't know how committed he is here, so your voice there would really matter. Representative Hines, who I think covers many of you there, hasn't been particularly engaged here, and he really should be. Everyone in Congress, this should be their top priority, because we are not going to beat COVID if we can't beat COVID disinformation. And we can't beat COVID disinformation. We don't do something about Facebook and Google. And so that I'm super optimistic about this, because I think the Biden administration understands that this is an issue, but mostly Congress is moving very rapidly. And no matter what you thought 2 years ago, they got their arms around it now. They really do. And there are a lot of members of Congress who get this stuff. And that includes most of the ones we need to get this across the line. That is definitely true in the House. On the Senate, it's a little harder, because the Senate is, it's so deeply dysfunctional right now that it's not clear what we can get done there.
Thanks. Kate, or maybe it's Tom Cook, are asking, how does the European response to these internet platforms differ than the US? And how do you think it's better or worse than our response?
Great question.
Thomas Friedman just wrote an editorial in the New York Times about this, that Europe could save us. What do you?
So Thomas Friedman, I'm sure he has many strengths. This is not one of them. So Europe is doing really, really good work. The advantage Europe has over the US is that their laws start from values. Our laws are entirely reflective of power. And so our laws are our laws change over time according to who's in power. The European laws tend to derive from a sense of, what are human rights? And so the big question is, the Europeans have adopted the premise that privacy should be a human right. I wish what they'd said was personal data is a human right, because the problem with the European approach is that they're approaching the market as though it's okay, we just need to regulate it a little bit at the margin. And I would argue, and I borrow this from my dear friend Shoshana Zuboff, professor from Harvard who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, that your personal data, your data voodoo doll, is an extension of your body. It's like a kidney or an arm and leg. It's not something that anybody should be allowed to sell, much less commercially exploit. And the Europeans, I think, have that idea, but they don't in the EU have the right mechanisms for either implementing the laws. Well, they may get the laws right, but their enforcement mechanisms lag way behind ours. We're terrible at making laws, but we're really good at enforcing them when we finally make them. And so here's my basic point, Tom. I love what they're doing in Europe. I love what just happened in Australia. It's a stupid law in Australia, but it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is these companies automate for the whole world. So the more different things people try, the closer we're going to come to good outcomes. So we don't need the same solution everywhere. In fact, we don't need the same solution in every state. The fact that Virginia just passed a privacy law and it's different than Maine, which is different than Washington, which is different than California, I consider that goodness. I mean, Oklahoma's working on one right now that's opt-in, which is like way better than the other four. And, if Oklahoma passes opt-in, I mean, I may move to Oklahoma City. It's, the cool thing is Oklahoma is about as red as you get. And they are about to become the leading light on privacy, which is a reason why I think we can be optimistic. Okay. And I love what Canada's looking at doing something. I mean, God bless. I mean, I'm open to everybody.
Is this a case of technology outpacing the law? So as soon as we outlaw one thing, will alternative something pop up? What do you think is the next big bad thing?
That is so great question. So here's what I think is really going on. I think that technology is a law unto itself, which is to say that when you're inside Facebook, Facebook decides what the law is. And Facebook is both judge and jury. Google on its own platform. So what's happened is these guys have set rules that have more effect on our daily lives than the law does, because most of us don't come close to breaking laws. But we run up against the issues inside these platforms constantly. And so I think what's wrong with this whole thing is that these are essentially governmental organizations with a different value system. And my point here is, when I said their value system is optimized for efficiency, not democracy and self-determination, what I'm really saying here is that's the debate we need to have. I mean, maybe if everybody understood it, they might say, you know, I'd rather have a corporation in charge than the government. I would hope they didn't do that, but I could imagine it happening. But the point is, we need to have that debate. We can't allow Facebook and Google to impose this on us without our consent. And that is what they are doing. And that's what monopolists do. Monopolists impose their will. The difference is these people also control the most important communication systems in our culture. So they control our politics. They control fundraising for all of these candidates. I mean, it's incredible how courageous the members of the House of Representatives are right now. Like around my Bay Area, you know, which is to say, so my member of Congress is Anna Eshoo. She has Google in her district. The adjacent district is Jackie Spear. She has Facebook and YouTube. They are my two of my staunchest allies in Congress. In spite of having these people in their districts, I mean, you want to see brave? The House of Representatives is so full of brave people right now. And, you know, it's like the people who know it best are the ones standing up to these guys. That should tell you something. And, I look at this and I'm so proud of them. I'm so proud of the members of the House. So if some of you, if you ever go to Rhode Island, I mean, David Cicilline, who runs the antitrust subcommittee, oh, he's so great. And, in Massachusetts, you've got Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. We're amazing. And, they're good members all over the place. Okay. And we just need to give them encouragement. And as I said, you got Blumenthal, who's fantastic. And you have other people in Connecticut who just need to be nudged in the right direction. Because I've met with your other senator, and I believe he would get there if enough of you guys like said, hey, yo, dude, get with the program.
We actually have people here from all over the country today. So,
so tell me where you're from, because there's good people everywhere. Okay. And like I said, if you're from Oklahoma, you go, girl, because that's Oklahoma is like, today they literally, their House of Representatives in Oklahoma passed the nation's first opt-in law. So it's got to go to their Senate. But oh my God, that was cool.
We've got North Carolina, Massachusetts, Rhode Island.
I see somebody from Chicago. So, and Illinois is definitely looking at this stuff. And the thing is, what I would say to each one of you is this should happen everywhere. This is our lives. Do we want to be in charge of our own lives, or do we want companies telling us what to do? My point here is what I'm talking about is not going to put these guys out of business. What I'm talking about doing is making them actually behave as responsible citizens and recognize that they don't have the right to undermine the public health, the democracy, self-determination, and competition that are what make this country great.
Charles Shaughnessy is asking, isn't old-fashioned advertising a watered-down version of behavior modification? And if that is how our use of tech is financed, how will tech companies agree?
So, great question. So, advertising before internet platforms was all broadcast model. It was absolutely about persuasion. It was absolutely an attempt to manipulate behavior. Its ability to do so was very limited. Okay. Other things like casino gambling, because they were able to create closed environments where they could control everything, were much more effective. The history of propaganda in the early days was all about this notion for propaganda to work. You had to control the same message had to be available in every medium all the time. And so if you couldn't control the entire information space, propaganda couldn't work. And so that's why advertising had limited success. When these platforms, we're on them hours a day, and everything is customized to you personally. And they tell you this is what you want, what you've asked for, but that's not really what's going on. They're playing with the parts of your psychology that you cannot resist. So you can't help but look. Your flight or fight kicks in, you have to look. And in doing so, this is at a completely different level. And, this is like the difference between having morphine as a prescription drug and not having it at all. You say, okay, morphine's not something you want people to have in the street, but in a prescription setting, that's okay. And the point is, there are times when that persuasion is okay, but as a business model, it's just way too dangerous.
Thanks. Following up on that, Wendy Rogovan is asking why the Trade Practices Act doesn't regulate this stuff as it is an unfair or deceptive act or practice in or affecting commerce under the Federal Trade Commission Act.
So, excellent question. It should. The Federal Trade Commission has been systematically defunded since 1980. So in 1980, we began an experiment with the notion that we should let the market allocate resources in all circumstances all the time. Historically, government played the role as the umpire, if you will, of capitalism, that it set rules and then enforced them fairly against everybody. And, capitalism's a little bit like a garden. You have to get rid of the weeds. And if you don't, entropy sets in and it devolves into monopoly. And so we began an experiment in 1980 where that's exactly what happened. We wound up at monopoly in every sector of the economy. The economy is more concentrated than ever before. Wealth is more unevenly distributed than it's been in 100 years. And we're in a situation where, we got hit by a pandemic that the economy wasn't prepared for. The economy was totally tuned to maximize shareholder value, so it didn't have any spare cycles to adapt to a shock like a pandemic. So we couldn't make PPE, couldn't make tests, still can't make PPE or tests. We had no infrastructure for distributing tests. We had no infrastructure for distributing vaccines. We're having to do all that on the fly. Any of you who's tried to get a vaccine knows how poorly the system's handling that. We have a situation where the economy generated $1.3 trillion worth of wealth during a pandemic for billionaires and less than zero for everybody else. And it's like, maybe we should have a conversation about that. Maybe there's a better way of doing it. And again, I'm not here to advocate that. I'm just making the point that that's where we are. And these guys are locking all that in. And so we should ask the question of where do we want things to wind up, right?
Andy Reith was wondering, saying, this sounds like a beautiful non or bipartisan issue. Each side comes to it from a different place, but could easily find common ground. Is the resistance really just from the platforms themselves?
Great question, Andy. So I think there are two problems. Obviously, the platforms have been incredibly effective in Washington. Again, remember that their tentacles are deep. So I'm going to say that 80 to 90% of all academic researchers around technology are funded to one degree or another by Facebook, Google, Microsoft, IBM, Amazon. So that skews research. All of the NGOs that, with the exception of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Anti-Defamation League, I think the NAACP and Color of Change, essentially all the other NGOs are funded to a very significant degree, that have a point of view here, are funded to a very significant degree by internet platforms. Members of Congress are very significantly funded, and almost all the research that they use is funded by these guys. So it's a very effective system. And that's a huge issue. But the other side of the problem is that in that 40 years when we were underfunding the Federal Trade Commission, we were underfunding the whole government. And we were putting in all these systems that simply, when I was a congressional aide, I was a legislative assistant in the mid 70s and up to 1980. So before I went to Tuck. And back in those days, we used to pass a very large law that's still in business today every month or so. And now, there hasn't been a significant law other than a fundraising thing since the ACA in 2009. Congress's ability to do anything at all has been destroyed because of the use of the filibuster. And so that's the other big problem. So you'd think we could get past that because it's bipartisan, but right now politics are based on the notion that it's better politics to have nothing happen. for one side at least.
Robin Levitt is wondering, what role does Gina Raimondo play as the new Secretary of Commerce?
This is going to be a great question, and I do not know the answer to this yet. The Secretary of Commerce deals with, interstate commerce issues. Typically, it's been transportation-based stuff. So I'm not sure what the role is going to be there. The prime movers on this are the Justice Department, Antitrust Division, the Federal Trade Commission. Those are big players, and then the banking regulators, because they control a lot of information. And Biden actually moved a guy from the Federal Trade Commission to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he will have the ability to control the bank's ability to sell their data to people. And that's very promising. Every agency of government should get involved. There was a hack last year of something called SolarWinds, which is a piece of commercial software used by every government agency and every big company. It should never have been used in a secure environment because the product was totally insecure. But it was used by everybody. It was hacked by the Russians, and the government systems are thoroughly penetrated. And this is a catastrophic failure. And realistically, we should be rebuilding the IT infrastructure of the entire government. Cancel a fighter jet, cancel aircraft carriers, because if you can't protect the data, weapons aren't going to do you any good. And I don't know if we're going to do that, but that's the scenario where every agency gets to be involved in this, including commerce.
Beth Tuttle Schechter is wondering what your view is of Parler and the actions of Google, Apple, and Amazon.
So Parler is, to call it an application is to give it slightly more credit than it deserves. It was very sloppily put together, and but it was an important locus for organizing Stop the Steal. And so a lot of things happened related to the insurrection on Parler, which is why people are so interested in it. And after the insurrection, Amazon, which hosted it, shut it down. And the reason I think they shut it down was that on Parler, there were all these other insurrections being planned after January 6th. And their view was, well, they could organize one on our platform and we could plausibly claim not to have known. But once the first one happens, if you know about more, you have to stop it. And so they had to stop it. I don't think they had legally any option there. And similar things happened with Apple in the App Store and Google and its App Store. And, I'm a big believer in freedom of speech. What I'm not a believer in is in amplification. I do not think that the business decision of internet platforms to amplify the most extreme speech in our society for profit is in the national interest. I would not have taken Alex Jones off of YouTube, but I also would have made it illegal for them to amplify him 15 billion times in 2 years, which is more than the combined reach of all the largest news organizations in the country over that time period. And, the issue with Trump is not, is it okay to have Trump on there? The issue is the way they amplified him. And, now we're in this really bad place where there are ballpark, 30% of the country that are convinced the election was incorrectly determined, notwithstanding mounds of evidence, and you can't persuade them otherwise. And these are not stupid people. They are not poorly educated people. It's not a good way to look at it. The correct way to look at it is to recognize that any person whose information context is that they're in a thing where extreme ideas circulate freely and nothing else gets in, if that goes on for more than a few months, those people will get radicalized. And that's just how the human psyche works. And it can happen to anybody. I mean, there are lots of other examples of that happening. I mean, it's how religions work. And, we don't have a problem with religions, but, there's some religions that people do have a problem with. But my basic point here is that it's when you do that for profit that I think we should, as a country, say, I'm sorry, you can't have that business model. But in general, I'm in favor of letting people speak, but I'm not in favor of letting people scream fire in a crowded theater. And I'm definitely not in favor of what the internet platforms did, which is to bring gasoline and a match to a crowded theater.
You know, I'm going to take a second here and do a quick wrap up, so that people who have to leave at 8 can leave, and then but Roger's very graciously agreed to stay on, if that's okay. Roger, huge thank you for joining us. This has been enlightening, and
I hope it was helpful. And again, it's a thought experiment. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but I am trying to give you some framework for thinking about the problem and appreciating why I've spent 5 years doing nothing but trying to get this message out.
Um, I thought it would be more terrifying than it is. It's nice to be uplifting to think there's a solution. Love the call to action. And speaking for Big Tent, we'll definitely do our part. We have this activism piece so we'll definitely do this part to reach out to our senators and Congress people. And everybody, thank you for joining us tonight.